I went into the Army in 1955 and I got out in 1958. In the meanwhile, they sent me to helicopter mechanic school and I was a crew chief on a helicopter for 3 years. And after I got out, I'm not quite sure what I wanted to do, but I had an older brother who was 15, 16 years older than me. I was the baby of the family. And he got into film early on after he got back from the war. In 1933, as a teenager, he went to Chicago's World's Fair, and Eastman Kodak had an exhibit there, and they gave him a 16mm piece of film to go home on. He kept looking at it, and he showed it to my father, and he says, I want to do that. My father would say, how can you make a living from things like that? And the war came along, he went in, he was sent to Pensacola Film School, became an aerial photographer in World War II, came home, and got into film in Chicago, got an apprenticeship program. And there were not many film labs in Chicago in those days, and he thought maybe they could open up a continuous film lab for processing film from newsreels and the television station. Became a big lab. And the reason, by way of saying that, after I got out of the Army, I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I went back to Venice, California, where I laid on the beach for 3 months. My brother called him up and said, he's going to be a bum if you don't find a job for him in your business. And I was interested in photography. I did a lot of it in the Army. They had dark rooms, recreational dark rooms. So I went to Chicago, and I got to the lab, and my brother gave me a bucket and a rag and some instructions like keep your mouth shut, keep your eyes open, maybe you'll learn something here. I did that for 5 years, and I learned film, and I went out with all the old newsreel cameramans, people who worked for Movietone News and Paramount and 20th Century Fox. They had newsreels all over the world in those days. But in the 50s, that was declining. So these old timers, which I am now, started working for television stations. And they were my teachers, they were my mentors, and I learned from them. And from 1958 to 63, I worked in that lab, and I got my first job with Movietone News as a cameraman. I had never worked professionally before. I shot a lot of things. I worked for nothing. I would go out and, like all of us in this business, any way we can do some shooting, we would, whatever it is. I did films for the Catholic Archdiocese in Chicago for Father Vanahan, who, of course, he said he never even bought me a cup of coffee, but he appreciated it. I landed a job with United Press Movietone News in 1963 in November, early November. And on November 22nd, the President of the United States was shot. And I was on a plane down there with my new bureau manager and my sound man, and ended up at the Dallas police station that night. And we saw Lee Harvey Oswald, and there are all kinds of iconic scenes now. He's walking down the hallway with the rifle, and black guy, and he's saying, I don't know why I'm here, I didn't do anything, and things of that nature. 2 days later, they were going to move him from the Dallas police station to another facility. And I was down there with a 16mm hand camera with 100 feet of film. And my bureau manager's off with a second crew trying to get some pickup shots. They didn't think this would be much of a shot, except he'd get in the car and he'd go away, and that's all we needed. Well, to make a long story short, I ended up standing next to Jack Ruby, who was the shooter. And I was about to shoot, and there was a live camera behind me, and the guy said, hey, you better squat down, you're blocking my shot. So I got down on my knees, brought my camera up at the same time they walked out, and I started rolling. Jack Ruby steps in and shoots him right in front of me, and I got it on film. Remarkable. I hadn't been on the job for more than a month, and got some notoriety from it. And when Movietone News closed in 1966, they went out of business. I got a call from CBS Network News the next day in Chicago, and I went to work for them for the next 40 years. That's how I got into the business. They were originally On the Road started in 1967, and a cameraman from Washington, D.C. named Jimmy Wilson worked with him, and it was so successful that he won a couple of Emmys right off the bat, first 2 years. And he decided he would go off to Hollywood and pursue a career in making motion pictures, theatricals. And Kuralt was short a cameraman. And my bureau manager in Chicago by the name of John Lane, around 1969, this was after the '68 convention in Chicago, which was a mess and a great story, a big story. And I kind of excelled during that period. I was in there making pictures that were useful. And he called him up and asked him, I've got a cameraman here who might fill the job if you're looking for another cameraman. And he said, send him out, I'll try him out for a week. And we went out, flew out to Washington with a 3-man crew. In those days in film, we shot 3 men. And we got on the bus, and I'd met Charles once before, but just very quickly, passing through Washington. And we went out on our first on the road series shoot that lasted for about 2 weeks. I was supposed to be there for a week and ended up 2 weeks, and I never went back to the Chicago Bureau again for the next 25 years. We hit it off. We were similar in our ages. We were similar in our backgrounds. He grew up from very humble beginnings on a tobacco farm, and I grew up in my humble beginnings on the south side of Chicago. And we're about the same age, about a year apart. And only thing, he was well educated, and some of it started to rub off on me. And we kind of hit it off. And of course, it was the best job there ever was in television. I'd spent 7 years being shot at, bricks thrown at me. They're not happy to see me. And here we drive into town and everybody's happy to see us. It was wonderful. The first story was a group of kids playing in the colorful fall leaves, reds and greens and blue. And they were just throwing them up in the air and sliding down the hill and playing, and they shot it. Jimmy did a great shot of all the angles you can possibly think of. Kuralt wrote a text on it. They put it on the evening news, the very first one, and the switchboards at CBS lit up because they say it's about time we see something other than the Vietnam War and all the bad things that are going on. America's still there, wow. And it became very popular. And after Jimmy won an Emmy for the first year of his work, he decided that he was going to go to Hollywood and work in films. And he didn't want to do this stuff anymore. He wanted to be in the big time. And they were looking for a cameraman. This was about 1968. And I had just finished an awful long couple of years chasing civil rights and the Vietnam protests and all over the place, and the civil rights in the South and Chicago. And I had a wonderful bureau manager by the name of John Lane. And John Lane called up Charles Kuralt and he said, I got a guy here who might work out for you. You want to try him out for a week. If you don't like him, send him back. I was lucky enough and inexperienced enough and lucky enough to get a crew like Charlie Quinlan, our electrician, worked in the stages of Chicago, knew film backwards and forwards, stage work, lighting, wonderful lighting man. And Larry Janeshi, who was the sound man with Edward R. Murrow on a documentary, our special on the Harvest of Shame. Looking back, nothing much has changed in migrant workers across America. It's about the same problems. Both of these men were World War II veterans. They were quite older than me. Charlie was in the Pacific on a destroyer. Larry was on another destroyer in the Pacific during some of the big battles. He was a medic, and he tells the story about moving his from one compartment to another. They asked him to switch over to another place. He hadn't left there for an hour, and a kamikaze plane killed everybody in that compartment that he had just left. And had a lot of experience in sound, and they were 1/3. Each of us had a 1/3 of the success of doing these pieces. After the first 10 or 12 got on the air, people started writing and they say, we saw your story about Mr. Norris who feeds the deer out in Colorado, and you ought to see about this story. We've down the street there's a guy who does this, and there's a lady who does that, and we pretty soon built a file by states. It was so popular, you cannot conceive of how popular On the Road was. Everybody who passed us up honked their horns. The truckers wanted to talk to us on the CBs. We'd have a file on the bus, and each state had a folder, and there were hundreds of stories, and we'd traveling through any state, we'd go through the files and we'd pick out some story ideas, make a few phone calls, see if it was worth going out there to shoot. One particular one, we found a story about a guy, about people who worm grunt. It was in a magazine, it wasn't in a letter. Worm grunting in Florida. And Charles had to go find out what worm grunting is. And he couldn't get a hold of anybody in the town. And we pulled up to a little country store in Shoppy, Florida, well off the beaten path. And there's a man sitting on the porch, and it's like in a movie. He was leaning back in his chair, and his foot was on the rail. And he looked over at Charles coming towards him, and when we got up to him, before Charles could say a word, he said, I was wondering when you were going to get here. Indeed, there was something called worm grunting. And what it amounted to was people in the neighborhood would hunt worms for fishing and sell them at very nice money. And they would pound a piece of oak into the ground and then rub a piece of steel over the edge of it so it would rump. It would make that noise and the ground would shake and the worms come up out of nowhere, and they would gather them all up, put them in cans and sell them for $5 a piece. And they were talking about how much money they made at it. Well, a year later, the story went on the air, but a year later, we got news that an IRS agent saw the story and went down there to find out about this money they're not reporting. And we'll never be able to go back to Shoppy, Florida. Even today, I think they would still remember us. We ruined their economy. We usually did good. I mean, we did good things, but in this case, it was not. The outcome was not wonderful. So. I tell this story. And it's almost unbelievable today, but we'd finish a story and get the exposed rolls of tape taped up, of film taped up real well. They're subject to X-ray. They couldn't travel today through airports. And we had what they called onion sacks, and it was open mesh sacks, and it said CBS News in yellow on the back. And we'd fill them up with our pieces, maybe 300, 400, 500 feet of film, tie it up, tape it up real good, and go to an airport, the closest one that would have a flight to LaGuardia in New York. And we'd go to the gate, and we'd look for someone who was nicely dressed or looked reliable, and say, we work for the Evening News with Walter Cronkite, and this is an On the Road with Charles Kuralt that we've shot here, and I maybe even tell them the storyline. And if you take this on the plane, walk off the plane, there'll be a courier in LaGuardia waiting for you. And any shows you want to watch at CBS, they'll be glad to get you tickets too. And they never refused, and we never lost a roll of film. This was before FedEx. This was before our Way Express Association. This was before there was no reliable way to ship film overnight to New York or anything else for that matter. And I tell people that story, and they can't believe it, considering today's security at the airports. And it was. Sometimes Charles would do it, and then they'd have to give an autograph or something. We went through 5 buses, 5 motorhomes, a period of 25 years. I think we did. Charles always liked to say, well, the miles didn't matter. We would rather travel 10 miles and find a story than travel 100 miles to shoot one, because you never know what you're going to find on the way. The idea was we have a destination, but we are so hopeful that looking out the window, we'll come across something better. And that happened many times. I remember one during the 70s. We were in Iowa and traveling a little country. We never traveled on a highway, never on the interstate, because as Charles said, every place looked like the last place you got to. They all looked the same. And so he said we travel where Indiana still looks like Indiana and Mississippi still looks like Mississippi. And we cross the railroad track, and it's a beautiful afternoon. It's like a Frank Capra movie. Lighting, trees, lovely fall, and a large group of people out on a front lawn in a farmhouse, a yellow ribbons around all the trees, and a big sign that said, "Welcome home, Roger." And I was driving, I looked out the corner of my eye, and I let my foot off the gas because I knew we were going to go back. And about 5 seconds later, Charles said, let's go see who Roger is. Roger turned out to be a returning Vietnam War veteran. We talked to the uncles, we talked to the grandmothers and grandfathers and his mother and father and his wife and a baby he's never seen. And we stayed there for about an hour, and I'd get people walking out to the highway and looking down the road for Roger, and then they'd go back in and get a beer, and somebody else would come out. And it was like we weren't there. They didn't pay any attention to us. They just went on with, they're waiting for Roger. And Charles came over and he said, "Let's go out. We're getting out. I want to get out of here before Roger gets here." I said, "What are you talking about?" "Roger." He says, "Roger's going to stand for every Vietnam vet coming home." This was a time when they were pretty much abused and ridiculed and spit on at airports and called baby killers and all that. And he didn't think that was right, and nobody in his right mind would have thought that was right. But that movie, that piece that we did, really set the stage for a little better feelings about those veterans coming home. We also did one with the Kiowa Indians, who welcomed their warriors home in a traditional dance out in Iowa at their reservation. Welcomed home their warriors as they welcomed home their warriors maybe 100 years before. These boys came home, they were Green Beret, decorated beyond belief, Purple Hearts, polished boots, and they came into the big round building that was the cultural center, and the drums were playing, and the chiefs were dressed in their finest, and they put buffalo robes on these young men, and they danced around. And Charles's narrative, which I wish I could remember, is another lesson in treating your homecoming warriors properly. I get a tear when I see that one. I was a helicopter mechanic, and I realized I was the only one that could make that thing work, and that I had job security. They couldn't get rid of me because I was the one who made it work. If the brakes went bad, in those days, early days of motorhome technology, it was very poor maintenance. And you'd call up a motorhome place and say, "Listen, we need a brake job on our, and what kind of motorhome do you have?" "Oh, it's Cortez." "Oh," he said, "we don't work on Cortez." Nobody worked on anything because they only worked on what they sold. So I've changed brake pads, I replaced bearings in the wheels when they burned out. Larry and I, in downtown Manhattan during the last convention we shot in New York, the Democratic Convention years ago, the air conditioner coil went out, and we took it to a place, and the guy says, "Well, we don't do that kind of work." And I says, "If I replace it, can you charge it for me?" He said, "Yeah." So I got out the toolbox, and I got under there in my overalls, and Larry and I are underneath the car removing the condenser, and we replaced it, and the guy charged us $200 to charge the unit. We were grateful. But the bus, the last bus was an FMC motorhome. We went through two Cortezes, a Winnebago, I forget the name of them all, it's been so many. And the Greenfield Village Museum in Dearborn, Illinois, which is Henry Ford's Museum of Americana, found out that On the Road was over with, and they asked if they could have the bus and enshrine it with my picture and Larry's picture and Charlie's pictures and Charles's picture and pieces that we did. And so they finally ended up with it. And one of these days I'm going to go back and visit it. I left some things on there 20 years ago. I'd like to get back. Road and Track did a piece on it, and they said acceleration was very poor. I did a lot of driving. I used to race cars back in the 60s before I got into CBS. When I was working for Movietone, my partner and I were racing sports, road racing. So I used to drive like Juan Manuel Fangio with the bus, you know. And we were coming down a mountain somewhere in Idaho, and I slipped the bus over to the right a little too far, and I was slowing down anyway, but the right front wheel dropped into the ditch, and we were there. That was it. And they were forming a throw his ass out of here party. And I said, hold on. I said, let me tell you, this part of the world, everybody drives with chains in their trucks, and the next guy that comes by, he's going to stop, hang on, hook onto the bus and pull us out of the ditch. Simple as that. Yeah. We waited a few minutes, and I had to defend myself. I was locking myself in the bathroom, I think. If it got worse, I would have locked myself up. They were really upset. And truly, 10 minutes later, a guy came with a pickup truck. You need some help? And I said, yes, we seem to be stuck here. He says, just a minute, I'll get my chain out. And he drove up in front, got the chain, hooked it underneath the chassis, pulled us out as easily. It was cork coming out of a bottle of wine. And we were on our way. And I offered him money, and he said, are you kidding? Get out of here. You know, this is Iowa or whatever, Kansas. We don't do that. So I was saved. Bicycle messengers. Charles wanted to do a piece on bicycle messengers in New York. They were everywhere you went, flying up and down the streets, wrong ways, they never stopped at lights. And he thought that would be a wonderful shoot. And my feeling was, how could I do it? Standing on a corner on a tripod with a camera wouldn't have been the way to go. And we waited a year or two, and Bernie Birnbaum, one of the executive producers of our program, came back with a Handycam, the first Handycam, the little camera as big as 2 packages of cigarettes, perhaps. And the idea was to get on the back of a motorcycle and chase them with the camera in my hand. And the engineers at CBS hooked up a little monitor about this big, and I could use my hand as a remote tripod or a remote crane and see exactly what I needed to see. So we could make running shots with these guys. We would be flying along, and he'd go behind one bus, and we'd come out on the other side of the bus, and all we see is this brrr, the bus, and we both pop out at the same time, and there he is. And we have him knocking on car doors saying, hey, get out of the way, chasing this guy all over, and the pictures were incredible, just incredible. Quality-wise, so-so. But no one had ever seen anything like that, traveling with these guys at 15 miles an hour through Manhattan, around the police on horses, around the taxi cabs, people carting bales of clothing in the garment district, and we'd get ahead, and he'd tell us where he was going. We'd get ahead, and we'd get him pulling him up. Pull up his bike, and he'd get the folder or the blueprints out and run into a building. And Charles would say he can get across Manhattan in 3 minutes, 4.5 minutes, whatever it was, and deliver it here. And I got a notice that I got an Emmy nomination for it. And I'm thinking, are you kidding? And I went to the dinner, first one. That was the second one I went to. A good friend of mine, the first one I went to. That's a story in itself. And didn't I win an Emmy? And it was really exciting, first one. And after that, I got about 5 or 6 Emmy nominations over the years, and I never bothered to go to the dinner. So they like you to come to the dinner, and your chances improve. But traveling to New York was more than I wanted it. First one that comes to mind, we were on as I said, the back roads were our freeways, 2-lane roads with rickety gas stations and farmhouses along the way and small communities. And I think we're crossing Texas somewhere on the way to. We stopped for gas at a place that can only be described as a Coen Brothers movie. It was a strange looking place and characters hanging around and not much of a facility. And we filled up the tank and we all got back in and we drove off. And Charlie Quinlan, we used to sit on the right front seat. Charles would be at the dinette because he was working a typewriter or whatever. And Larry would be in the back working on his sound gear. And I'm driving along and about an hour goes by and I look in the mirror and I said, "Where's Larry?" And we're actually looking under the counter. Maybe Larry fell down. There's no Larry on the bus. We turned around and went back another hour, and there's Larry sitting outside the gas station doing the New York Times crossword puzzle. Very calmly, he says, "I knew you'd remember I was gone. I think you'd figure it out." You know? So Vic Tianka is a traffic cop in Pittsburgh. He owns that corner. And he's a lovely man. He's been doing it for umpteen years. I don't even think he wore a gun anymore. And he would just beg, "Come on, please." You know? So we were shooting the story. It's kind of fun. It's very short. We had the bus parked on a side street somewhere, and I was reloading the camera, and Larry was in getting something, and Charles was in there getting a cup of coffee or whatever. And there's a knock on the door. All our buses were painted white. And Charles says, "Oh, another fan. Well, let's see, who we got here?" And he'd opened the door, and the little lady said, "I'd like 2 quarts of milk, please." She thought we were the milk truck or something. They still delivered milk by wagons there. And Charles says, "Ma'am, I wish I had 2 quarts of milk for you, but we work for television," and so on. She says, "Oh," and she closes the door and walks away. And Charles says, "You know, you need to get set back every once in a while." Alligators all over the place. So we had a guy with us, a substitute sound man. His name was Tom Crosgrove from Florida. And the guy driving the John boat, was a flat-bottom boat, was an old alligator poacher who now worked for the state to preserve alligators. And he'd shoot off King Edward cigars one at a time. Tom was in the back of the boat, and Tom would go out after work and go find a beer joint and have a couple of 2-3 beers. And he'd wake up in the morning with a slight hangover, and he was wishing he had a beer, and it was a hot day. And he was sitting in the back of the boat, and we're just trolling along real slow, and it was hot and steamy. And the man who showed King Arthur cigars one half of a time was talking about his life as a poacher, and we were shooting it. And I look over, and I see a 6-pack of beer float by. Tom sees a 6-pack of beer. And like it was supposed to happen, he just reached in, pulled out of the water, popped one open. It was a miracle for Tom anyway. That's the one where when we screened, we were shooting a bird sitting on a rock. Well, it wasn't a rock. It was an alligator's head this big, and the alligator didn't move. And finally, the bird flew away, and we followed the bird. And with our eyes, but I stuck on the alligator. The alligator just chew you up in a second. One of my favorites was a story about a man named Mr. Black from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And he made bricks in a very fundamental way, maybe how they made them 1,000 years ago, with sand and water and clay. and a mud mule. A mule would go around in a circle, turning a paddle in the center. And in the center, Mr. Black would pick up these scoops of material and slop them into molds, scrape them off, and there were 6 bricks. And he'd take it out, and he would do that all day. And his helpers would stack them, and they would dry, and he made bricks, very good bricks. And one Sunday morning, he got dressed up, and we walked around Winston-Salem. And he was a very dapper man. I'm not sure if he was a son of slaves, but certainly grandson of slaves, and probably never out of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, or maybe a few miles out. He had a granddaughter, very nice lady who looked after him, but he was still working at the age of 92, making bricks. And he would walk through town with us, and he'd put on his vest and a cane, and he'd point to the church. I made the bricks for that church. Yes, I did. And these bricks you're walking on, about 40 years ago, and that building over there, and that school over there, and the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, I made all the bricks, and you see this monster building that runs for 1/4 of a mile. 1,000,000-something bricks he made for Mr. Reynolds, who he described as coming out to his place on horseback, you know. He rode a horse, you know, he said. And Mr. Black related the story of how, when they were orphaned, he and his brother had a talk. And he said, we got to find us a trade that'll make us some money, and maybe somebody will call us Mr. Black. That story went on the air, and somebody at the State Department in Washington saw that story on the Guyana desk in South America, Guyana. And he went to his bosses and he said, I have a great idea. We have to get that man to come to Guyana and show people out in the woods out there, out in the rural areas, how to make bricks for houses that'll last. Most of the wood rots after 20 years in that part of the world. And he got it set up. President Nixon got word of that, and he called up Mr. Harvey J. Wetherill, that was his name, wonderful name for a government agent, and said, I want those folks to come to the Oval Office to send them off. So Mr. Black, who'd never been out of Winston-Salem, his grandchildren, his granddaughter, and 5 boys from the neighborhood who helped him make bricks, came to Washington and walked into the Oval Office and was greeted by the President of the United States, Mr. Black, the grandson of a slave, perhaps. And he went off to Guyana, and we followed him. We went to Guyana with him. And the Prime Minister of Guyana was a black gentleman, and everybody in Guyana was a black gentleman. And he had never been in a community where he was a remnant of the Old South, and it was an eye-opener to him, and the best time he ever had, I suspect. There was a farmer by the name of Bill Bowditch in Iowa, who for 40 years hated being a farmer. And for about 20 of those years, he built a 54-foot steel yacht in his backyard, in his barnyard. And we went out on 2 occasions to get him welding and putting this thing together. And he and his wife, Bill must have been in his 60s, couldn't wait to auction off that farm, get in that boat, and go to the Caribbean. He talked about going to Nice and going to the Mediterranean and visiting the Greek Isles. And it was his passion. And every night he would go to work on this 54-foot steel yacht. And it was getting to the point where it was finished. And we have shots of Mamie, his wife, loading the freezer. And we came back for the launching. Larry and I came back for the launching. Charles stayed in New York. There was no reason for him to come. And we got the bus, the truck picking it up, huge thing. And it comes rolling down the highway. And I ran out into a field where there was some corn flowing. And you see the top of the boat floating through the field of corn. And then I got some cows in the corn in a shot, and people along the way waving and all that. And we got it launched and put it in the water, and he ran aground, and we got that too. And I called up Charles on the way back, and I said, well, we got it. It's in the water. And he says, well, what have you got? I says, well, you know, it's the goodbye to the corn and goodbye to the cow shots. And there was this pause, and he says, "You shoot them, I write them." And he used it. He says, and in Charles's wonderful voice, "Well, it's a goodbye to the corn and goodbye to the cows and on to the Mediterranean." But he was funny that way. He was a lovely man. Edna Gardner White, a lovely woman, barnstormer back in the 20s. She tells the story of how men got in her way all the time. They didn't want to teach her to fly. They say women can't learn to fly. She found somebody who would teach her. She soloed, and she said, "After I soloed the first time, I didn't need another man in this world," just like that. And for almost 25 years, she flew commercially, I think, for private planes. She raced against Amelia Earhart. In those days, they had what they call pylon racing, in which they would race around pylons set several miles apart. And she always won. She had a room half this size full of trophies. And what she liked to do was teach young girls to fly. And we have shots of her talking to a little 16-year-old girl and I went up with her to get the cutaways of her flying, and she started putting me into a barrel roll. And the plane went up and over, and I started to get a little queasy. And we did one more, and then she says, "You want to do it again?" And I'm laughing because I'm saying, no, I don't want to do it. No more. And I'd done some zero-G gravity flights at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I went up with the astronauts floating around inside, and that made me sick too, but I wasn't afraid that we would fall out of the air. But what happened was, when we were doing external shots of her flying from another airplane, she pulled it up and the back of her seat snapped, and the plane went, you can see it in the piece, her plane just went like this. And then she recovered. And when she came back down, she showed us how the seat snapped, and she almost fell out of the plane. So if that would have been me in there, it would have been even worse. And when we did get down, I laid on her kitchen floor for about an hour, holding onto the floor so it wouldn't fly away from me. That's how seasick I was, air sick. What did it take to be a woman in her 20s to get to where she wanted to be, which was fly an airplane? Incredible. So many people like that we did. We'd get into a motel sometime after a shoot, and we just finished shooting on the days of film, and we'd get in about 11 o'clock at night and grab a beer and go to bed. Next morning, if we were in a college town, kids, journalism students on the way to school would see the bus. And that was what everybody wanted to do. They wanted to do Charles Kuralt stories, and 4 or 5 of them would come by about 7:30 in the morning, and they'd ring his room. And they say, "Mr. Kuralt, my name's Joe, I'm Joe, whatever, and we're at the journalism school here in so-and-so," or whatever it was. It happened many times. "How about coming out and talking to us about television?" And he'd get up. And I can see him sit at the edge of the bed and said, "All right, give me a minute." And he'd light a cigarette, and he'd get dressed, and he'd come out, and he'd have coffee and talk to him for 2 hours. He had that, he needed to do it. It was his obligation. He was obliged to be part of what he could send forth in what he could say to these young students who wanted to be in television or newspapers. He started out in newspapers, but he was very good with his time. One other memory, there's so many, but the images that I can conjure up and visualize even now was a kind of a ritual after we did shoot a story, and I'd get up early, work on the cameras. When we worked in film, you had to clean the gate and reload the magazines and tape everything up for shipment to New York to be developed and edited. And I'd make a big pot of coffee and turn on the radio, and Charles would wander out, get on the bus, and kind of nod to each other and light a cigarette and look at the papers and pour himself a cup of coffee and put more sugar in it or cream or whatever it was and drink it and read the paper. And I'd keep working on the back. And this would go on for about a half hour, 20 minutes. And all the time I could see his jaw going like that. He was thinking. And he'd put the paper down and he'd go over and get another cup of coffee and look out the window as though he were just waiting for a moment. And when that moment came, he'd bring out the typewriter, no computers, put a piece of paper in and start typing. And he didn't finish typing until it was finished. I mean, he didn't stop. He wrote the whole 4 or 5 minute piece from notes and from memory watching me shoot. In those days in videotape, we didn't get a chance to screen it back after we shot it. It was in the latent image and had to be developed. And he'd pop it off in about an hour, 45 minutes. Larry would come out and we'd get the camera and we'd put some film in it. He'd narrate on a piece of film, MagnaStripe, and we'd package it up and send it off. That would happen so many times after every shoot, so he'd get the piece off to New York. Well, he was very generous with his time, mostly his time. I remember we stopped at a gas station once in the, I shouldn't say the middle of nowhere, but it wasn't anywhere you'd know. And there was a guy there in his car with 2 children and a wife, and he didn't have a dime left in his pocket. And Charles got to chatting with him. And Charles gave him a couple $100. He just couldn't have left that place knowing that there was somebody who needed help. That's who he was. And he did that everywhere. Eddie Lovett was a story we did. Eddie Lovett was a migrant farmer in Arkansas. He was in the Navy during World War II, and he began to read. And when he got out, he built himself a library as to declare war on his ignorance, as he said. And he had a library the size of this room with a big potbelly stove in it. And his kids went to the and he integrated the school. This was back in the 70s. His daughter was the valedictorian of her class. And Charles found out about it and came to her graduation and said a few words to the class. He didn't have to, no one asked him. My brother and I were both in the same business. Thanks to him, I was in the same business. And the Chicago Journalism Hall of Fame in Chicago, mostly news writers, came to the conclusion one day that we don't have any cameramen. Chicago's got a great history of cameramen who traveled all over the world. So they picked us to be in the first cameraman to be in the Chicago Journalism Hall of Fame, which was not exactly a journalism hall of fame. It was a dinner once a year at the National Press Photographers Club. And I didn't tell Charles about it, because if he did, he'd have to get on a plane. He'd feel, I never asked him to do anything, rarely, because he couldn't say no. He couldn't say no. And we're at the dinner, everybody's standing around waiting for things, and in walks Charles. And it made my heart, as he said, he used to make my heart beat fast. And got up and told some lovely stories about my brother and myself and his connections to Chicago. He did that all the time. He did that all the time. Charles wrote about Larry, Charlie, and me, which was Charlie Quinlan, Larry Janeshi, and Izzy. And he started out by saying, a relationship with a cameraman is like a love affair. And sometimes they get wooed away by other people, and we sure didn't want to lose him. And he went on and said some, I'm almost embarrassed by it sometimes, but it was a very heavy feeling between all of us. But the relationship between Charles and me was a little thicker. The other guys had families to run off to. I did too, But we'd go sailing together. I'd take a week or so. We'd sail the Chesapeake. He loved sailing, and I had a sailboat. He'd come to Chicago a couple of times when he was writing his autobiography. We spent some time on the boat, and it was like being with an old friend. I outlived most of my old friends. I didn't have that many because of my travels. You don't stop to make friendships too often. The neighborhood I lived in, I'd come and visit once in a while. I think my two girls, we were introduced to each other when they were in their teens. So they've forgiven me over the years. He was everything I would have liked to have been. He had a major of American history, and he never graduated because he got involved with the newspaper at the University of North Carolina. And from that newspaper and from other things he did, he got a job early on in his 20s when we're writing for CBS News. And his autobiography really is worth reading. His early, he was in the Congo doing when the colonials left the Congo, the Dutch, I guess it was, and when you read it, you realize how close he came to being killed, murdered. He'd been to Vietnam on 2 trips and seen photographed combat with a very brave cameraman by the name of Jerry Sims. I was asked to go to Vietnam and I refused. I'd had enough of my Army career. I did an interview with a newspaper once about Charles. They were doing a profile on him. They asked me, and I was trying to explain Charles's softness, and I said, it just blurted it out. I said, you know, if Charles was a woman, he'd have been pregnant all the time, because he couldn't say no. He couldn't say no to anybody. Anybody had a problem, you came to Charles. And I remember when there were a lot of cutbacks at CBS, he went to the bat for 6 people. And they listened to him, and they kept their jobs. He would do things that he felt were morally right. He had to do it. It ended with a phone call. It got to the point where getting Charles to the airport in time on a Friday night, Saturday the latest, but usually Friday, because he spent Sunday rewriting everything that was written for him into his own way of speaking. He had a great writer, Peter Freundlich. And on one occasion we missed a flight, and we were in Moab, Utah, doing a story about the most beautiful dump in America in the national park where John Ford shot all those cowboy movies with Stagecoach, and I don't know if you've seen them. And we started up the bus one morning and it wouldn't run. It would go, and we were getting later and later to make the plane. And it's icing up, I said. And Larry said, we don't have any de-icer. And he said, we got gin in the freezer. So we took out a bottle of gin and a bottle of cognac, whatever, and poured it all in the gas tank. And we got it running. And we took off and got him to the airport, but it was too late. I thought that was a reasonable use of all that good alcohol. How did it end? How did the best job that ever a cameraman had end? And turned out to even better almost. I got a call from him. He says, it's the good news, bad news call. And I says, yeah. He says, listen, he said, I can't do this anymore. I can't do both. It's just, I don't have a breath in me left after a week of this. 4 days on the road, 3 days in New York, back again. On the road we're just gonna park it and call it a day for that. I can't do it anymore. But he said, here's what I've done. I've talked to Linda Mason, the executive producer of CBS Sunday Morning, which is an hour-and-a-half program every Sunday morning. And you're going to be the staff cameraman from now on. You still live in Chicago. You can do whatever you want, travel where you want, but you belong to them now. And since I'm on the program, you belong to me too. So he looked out for me. And you know, it turned out to be another 20-something years with CBS Sunday Morning. And also, I ended up shooting for CBS 60 Minutes and 48 Hours. We did Revolution in Prague. We did the Tiananmen Square. We were there for, Charles was on that story. We were there for 6 weeks in Tiananmen, China then. And meeting all kinds of great artists in music and theater and performers and football stars and baseball stars and profiles on all of these people. And you get to hang around with them. It's just amazing. And it turned out to be almost as good as on the road. We didn't have as much freedom. On the road, never knew where we were at any given time. Charles wouldn't have it any other way. Many of them I have never seen. In the days of film, it was hard to get a print. Today you can pop one off out of a DVD. But up to that point, I rarely saw any of them. The only time we might have caught one is that if we called New York and they said there was going to be one on Friday night and we were out on the road, we'd go into a town somewhere and look for a motel or a furniture store. We'd park in front of a furniture store and walk in that had TV sets running in the window. And we'd say, listen, we work for CBS. We have a program on tonight. Do you mind if we watch yours? Of course they'd let us watch, and we'd watch our piece. And we saw about maybe a fourth of them under those conditions. But now that Acorn's come out with these sets, I look at some of them and I said, how do they get away with that? And I look at some of them and I say, wow, they're pretty good. Not bad at all. But it's Charles' narrative is what carries you through. You could just, as I said, you can just close your eyes and listen to the words, and the pictures are there. I've had people describe scenes on the road that they saw, and they weren't in the picture. It was what they heard from Charles that got into them. He described something that stuck with them that they think they saw. It wasn't there. A lot of respect for older people and the stories they told us. And the little things that seemed so ordinary, like Mrs. Burgess, who opened her kitchen for people to come and eat in. She got up every morning at 4 o'clock, big, it was in the South, I think, and people from all over knew that they would come and have lunch at Mrs. Burgess. And you didn't have to pay, but if you wanted to, there was a place where you put some money in. And it was lawyers and doctors and judges, and everybody would come and congregate in her kitchen. And she said, well, I've always wanted to live by the side of the road and be a friend of man. That was my way of wanting to be. And there's a scene in there in which she's saying, well, I'm getting behind. You stir that rice for me. And Charles went over and stirred the rice. And he says, I'm sorry, I hope you catch up. She says, well, that's why you're stirring the rice for me. I need to get caught up here. And it was just this wonderful give and take between her and Mrs. Burgess. There are a lot of shots of the bus traveling through the country. We spent, when Charles wasn't with us, we'd go out and make running shots of the bus for future use, to be used for a piece or for a special. And there was one shot that I made. There was a hill that we would climb up on a highway, and at the apex of the hill, a dog ran out and chased the bus alongside the road. And I was driving and I looked at the dog, and he'd go so far and he'd stop and run back and regroup. And I'm thinking, that's a great shot. So when we finished shooting what we were doing, we came back and I had him drop me off at the bottom of that hill. The dog came back on the other way. So they dropped me at the bottom of the hill with a long camera lens, and the bus turned around and the dog chased him over the hill again. And as they came back, the bus shows up, and the dog comes out and runs alongside the bus until it stops. And it is a great picture. It is on the road, you know, it's wonderful.